"That rifle belongs in a museum," the man in the brand new Sitka jacket said, loud enough for the entire camp to hear. He was pointing at the scratched, beaten-up bolt action leaning against a pine tree, its wooden stock dark with age and scarred with gouges that looked like they had been earned, not decorated. The old man sitting beside it on a folding camp chair said nothing. He just looked at the fire, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of black coffee, and let the laughter roll over him like wind over stone. 6 hunters. All of them half his age or less. All of them carrying rifles that cost more than most people's first car, and not one of them knew that the quiet old man they were laughing at had once used that same battered Mosin-Nagant to do things none of them could imagine. In a frozen valley on the other side of the world, where missing a shot didn't mean losing a trophy, it meant losing your life. If this story hits you, type respect in the comments right now, because what happened next at that camp silenced every single one of them. Earl Whitfield had not planned on going hunting that October. He was 78 years old, and his knees told him so every morning when he swung his legs off the side of the bed in his small house outside of Harlan, Kentucky. The house was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, with yellow linoleum that had been there since his wife Patricia had picked it out in 1971, and a front porch where Earl spent most of his evenings watching the tree line change colour as the seasons turned. Patricia had been gone 6 years now. Cancer. The kind that starts quiet and finishes loud. Earl had held her hand through every minute of it, the same way he had held his rifle through every minute of Korea, steady, even when everything around him was falling apart. After she passed, the house got quieter, and Earl got quieter with it. He still walked to the post office every morning, still had coffee at Mabel's diner on Tuesdays and Thursdays, still kept the yard trimmed and the gutters clean. But the light in his eyes had dimmed some, and the people in town who knew him well enough noticed it. His neighbour Roy Danvers was one of those people. Roy was 62, retired from the mines, and he had known Earl for over 30 years. He knew Earl had served in Korea. He knew Earl didn't talk about it much. And he knew that the one thing that still put a spark in the old man's eyes was the fall deer season, when the mountains turned copper and gold and the air tasted like wood smoke and wet leaves. So when Roy's nephew Brad organised a group hunting trip up to a private parcel of land in the Daniel Boone National Forest area, Roy made sure Earl got an invitation. Earl had resisted at first, said his knees weren't up for it, said he didn't want to slow anybody down. But Roy had leaned on him the way only an old friend can, gentle but persistent, and eventually Earl had nodded and said he'd come along. He pulled the Mosin-Nagant out of the back of his closet that evening, wiped it down with an oiled rag, and worked the bolt a few times. The action was still smooth, it always had been. The camp was set up in a wide clearing on the side of a ridge, about 4,000 feet up, where the hardwoods gave way to a mix of pine and hemlock, and the views stretched for miles across layered blue-green ridges fading into haze. There were 2 wall tents, a fire ring made of stacked creek stones, and a makeshift table built from sawhorses and plywood, where the men cleaned gear and played cards after dark. Roy and Earl arrived on a Thursday afternoon, pulling up the gravel forest road in Roy's old Ford, their gear rattling in the bed. The other 4 hunters were already there. Brad Danvers, Roy's nephew, was 34, an insurance adjuster from Lexington, who had gotten into hunting 3 years ago and treated it the way some men treat golf, as a lifestyle brand as much as a sport. His rifle was a Browning X-Bolt in 6.5 Creedmoor, topped with a loopholed Vorivanx 5HD scope that cost more than Earl's monthly pension check. Brad's buddy Kyle Messer was about the same age, a car dealership manager who wore camo like it was a fashion statement and carried a custom-built Bagara with a carbon fibre stock. Then there was Trent Holloway, 28, a CrossFit enthusiast and self-proclaimed tactical hunter, who had a Ruger precision rifle chambered in .308 with a bipod, a muzzle brake, and enough rail attachments to make it look like something out of a video game. The 4th was Dale Sizemore, 45, a quiet electrician from Corbin who had been hunting since he was 12 and generally kept to himself. Dale was the only one of the group who didn't seem to have anything to prove. He nodded at Earl when they arrived and helped him carry his pack to the tent without being asked. The trouble started almost immediately. Not in a mean-spirited way at first, more like the casual, careless cruelty of men who don't realise they're being cruel because they've never been tested by anything that matters. It started with the rifle. Earl carried the Mosin-Nagant in a canvas case that was almost as old as the gun itself. When he pulled it out and leaned it against the pine tree near his chair, Brad was the first one to notice. He walked over with a beer in his hand and looked at the rifle the way you might look at a flat tire. "What the heck is that?" he said, grinning. Earl glanced up. "Mosin-Nagant," he said simply. "Model 9130, 762 by 54. Brad turned to Kyle and Trent, who were setting up a spotting scope on a tripod near the fire ring. "Hey fellas, come check this out. Earl brought a piece of history." They wandered over. Trent picked up the rifle without asking, which made Earl's jaw tighten slightly, though he said nothing. Trent worked the bolt, looked through the open iron sights and laughed. "Dude, there's no scope on this thing." "Don't need one," Earl said quietly. "What do you mean you don't need one?" Trent said, holding the rifle at arm's length like it was a curiosity. "How are you going to shoot past 100 yards with iron sights? You're 70-something, right? No offense, but your eyes can't be what they used to be." "I see well enough," Earl said. Kyle took the rifle from Trent and turned it over, and was running his thumb across the deep gouge in the stock just forward of the trigger guard. "What happened here?" he asked. Earl looked at the gouge for a moment and something passed behind his eyes. Something old and cold and far away. "Rock splinter," he said. "Long time ago." Kyle waited for more, but more didn't come. He handed the rifle back. Brad had pulled out his phone and was already looking something up. "Mosin-Nagant," he read aloud. "Bolt-action military rifle, first produced in 1891 for the Russian Empire. Used extensively in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War." He looked at Earl. "Korean War. Is that where you got this?" Earl nodded once. "So this thing is like 70, 80 years old," Brad said, looking at the others with raised eyebrows. "That's wild, man. Seriously. Why, that belongs in a museum." The laughter came easy and thoughtless, the way it does when men are showing off for each other. Trent said something about bringing a musket to a gunfight. Kyle made a crack about iron sights and bifocals. Brad offered to let Earl borrow his backup rifle, a Savage Axis with a cheap scope, the way you might offer a child a plastic toy. Earl declined politely. Roy, standing by the truck with an armload of firewood, watched the whole exchange with his lips pressed tight. He knew better than to say anything on Earl's behalf. Earl wouldn't have wanted that. The old man had never needed anyone to fight his battles. That first evening around the fire, the talk was all about gear, ballistic coefficients, muzzle velocities, the merits of 6.5 Creedmoor versus 308 Winchester versus 300 Winchester Magnum. Trent pulled up a long-range ballistics app on his phone and started running calculations for shots at 800, 900, 1,000 yards, talking about bullet drop and wind drift with the confidence of someone who had learned everything from YouTube and nothing from experience. Brad talked about the Leupold scope on his Browning, how the custom BDC reticle was dialed in for his specific hand loads, how he had spent 2 weekends at a precision rifle course in Texas, where they had shot steel at 1,200 yards. Kyle mentioned he was thinking about getting into PRS competitions. The word precision was used so many times it started to lose its meaning. Earl sat in his camp chair and listened to all of it. He didn't contribute, didn't correct, didn't feel the need to explain that when he had learned to shoot, there were no ballistic apps, no custom BDC reticles, no weekend courses. There was a drill sergeant, a frozen rifle range at Fort Benning, and the knowledge that if you couldn't put a round where it needed to go, someone was going to die. He finished his coffee, rinsed the tin cup in the creek, and went to bed early. Roy caught his eye as he ducked into the tent. "You all right?" Roy asked quietly. Earl gave him a small half smile. "I'm fine, Roy. They're just boys." He said it without malice, but also without doubt. The first full day of hunting was a Friday. They were up before dawn, breath visible in the cold mountain air, the sky above the ridge still full of stars. Earl moved slowly in the half-light. The way men with bad knees and old injuries learn to move, deliberate, measured, never wasting a step. He wore the same canvas hunting jacket he had worn for 30 years, faded olive green with leather patches at the elbows, over layers of wool and flannel. His boots were old Red Wings, resoled twice. He looked like a man from another era because he was one. The plan was to split up and cover different sections of the ridge. Brad had printed out a topographic map from an app and assigned positions like he was running a military operation, complete with GPS coordinates and rally points. Earl looked at the map, orienting it to the terrain with a glance the way someone who has read terrain for survival does instinctively, and said he'd take the eastern edge, near the deep ravine that cut through the mountain like a knife wound. It was the hardest approach, steep, with loose shale and thick laurel thickets, and Brad seemed almost relieved that the old man had volunteered for it, since it meant no one else had to deal with it. "You sure about that, Earl?" Brad asked, with a tone that suggested he thought the old man might fall and break a hip. "That's some rough country over there." "I've seen rougher," Earl said, and shouldered his rifle and started walking. He didn't take a GPS. He didn't need one. The mountain told him everything he needed to know. The morning hunt produced nothing for anyone. The deer were there. Fresh sign everywhere. Rubs on saplings, scrapes in the dirt, tracks in the soft mud along the creek bottoms. But the animals themselves were ghosts. As moving through the timber in the grey half-light before dawn, and bedding down in the thick stuff before the hunters were in position. Brad had set up an elaborate ground blind with shooting sticks and a rangefinder, but nothing came within 500 yards. Trent had positioned himself on a rocky outcrop with his bipod-mounted Ruger, looking like a sniper in a movie, but the only thing that moved in front of him all morning was a pair of wild turkeys. Kyle had dozed off against a tree and missed a doe that walked within 50 yards of him. Dale told him about it later, having watched the whole thing from his own position up the ridge, and Kyle's face went red. Earl came back to camp at midday with his jacket open and the Mosin-Nagant across his shoulders, barrel and stock resting in the crooks of his elbows, looking like he had been walking mountain ridges his entire life because he had. He reported seeing a large buck, 8 points, maybe 10, moving through the timber on the far side of the ravine early that morning, too far and too fast for a shot, but he had marked the area and noted the wind direction and the angle of the game trail. He relayed this information simply and precisely, the way someone trained in reconnaissance relays intelligence. Brad listened with half an ear, scrolling through something on his phone. Cool, he said. "Hey, there's supposed to be a cold front pushing through tomorrow morning. Deer should be moving big time. We'll probably get some action then." Trent chimed in from the card table, where he was reassembling his bolt carrier group after an unnecessary field cleaning. "If that big buck shows up, I'll take him at 800 yards easy. My Ruger is zeroed dead on at 100. I've got the dope out to 1200. Earl looked at him for a moment. "Wind's going to be tricky through that ravine," he said. "Thermals push up slope in the morning, but the front will be coming from the northwest. You'll get crosswind and updraft at the same time." Trent blinked. "I've got a wind app for that," he said, holding up his phone. Earl nodded slowly and said nothing else. He went to his tent, took off his boots, and lay down for a nap. Roy, who had been watching from his chair by the fire, shook his head and smiled to himself. He had seen that look on Earl's face before, the quiet patience of a man who knows something the room hasn't figured out yet. That evening the mocking escalated. They had all been drinking, cheap beer and bourbon from a shared bottle, and the conversation had turned to war stories, which none of them had but all of them seemed to want. Brad talked about his grandfather who had served in Vietnam, though from what Earl gathered the grandfather had been a supply clerk in Saigon. Trent mentioned that he had almost joined the Marines out of high school, but had decided against it because, quote, "I couldn't handle someone telling me what to do." Kyle said he respected the military, but that modern warfare was all drones and technology now, implying that the old ways of fighting were obsolete. At some point, someone asked Earl directly about Korea. "You were in Korea, right, Earl?" Brad said. "What was that like?" Earl stared into the fire for a long time, the flames reflected in his pale blue eyes, and the shadows carved his face into something older and harder than the men around him could comprehend. "Cold," he said finally. "It was cold." They waited for more, but the word hung in the air like the smoke from the fire, heavy and final. Trent, emboldened by bourbon, pressed further. "Did you actually see combat? Like, were you in a battle or anything?" Earl's hand tightened on his coffee cup, just slightly, just enough for Roy to notice. "Chosin Reservoir," Earl said quietly. "November through December, 1950. The name meant nothing to them. Not a single one of the younger men recognized it. The Chosin Reservoir, where 17,000 American and Allied troops were encircled by over 100,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. Where frostbite casualties outnumbered gunshot wounds. Where Marines and Army soldiers fought their way out through a frozen nightmare that lasted 17 days. Where Earl Whitfield, then a 22-year-old corporal with the 7th Infantry Division, had used the same Mosin-Nagant, captured from a dead Chinese soldier on the second night of the breakout, to do things that still visited him in the small hours of the morning when the house was too quiet and the darkness was too deep. He had picked up the Chinese rifle after his own M1 Garand's operating rod froze solid in the unbearable cold. The Mosin-Nagant, designed for Russian winters, worked when nothing else would. Earl had carried it for the next 12 days through ice and blood and horror, and he had never put it down since. But he didn't say any of this. He just said chosen reservoir and let the silence do the talking. The silence, however, was wasted on men who didn't know what they were hearing. Brad nodded the way people nod when they're pretending to understand, and then the conversation drifted to something else, which Broadhead Kyle should use for archery season, and Earl was forgotten again. Except by Roy, who sat across the fire with his eyes glistening and his throat tight, because Roy knew. He had seen the medals once, years ago, in a shoebox in the back of Earl's closet. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart with cluster, the Korean Service Medal with 4 campaign stars. Earl had never displayed them, never mentioned them, never filed for any special veterans' benefits beyond his basic pension. He had just come home, married Patricia, worked 40 years at the lumber mill, and lived his life. The rifle was the only thing he kept, and even that he kept in the closet, out of sight, taken out only for deer season and the occasional afternoon at the range, where the old hands who shot there knew enough not to ask questions about the stock with the gouge in it. The next morning came in grey and cold, just as Brad's weather app had predicted. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s overnight, and a stiff northwest wind was bending the treetops and sending dry leaves skittering across the ground like small frightened animals. This was the kind of morning deer move. The barometric pressure was falling, the rut was approaching, and the cold front was pushing every animal in the forest to feed before the weather turned worse. The men were in position by 5:30, spread across the ridge in their assigned spots. Earl had gone back to the eastern edge near the ravine. He had found a natural seat in a cluster of rocks just below the ridgeline, a spot that gave him a clear view across the ravine to the far slope, where the timber opened up into a natural meadow maybe 400 yards wide. He settled in with the Mosin-Nagant across his knees, the bolt open, a single round between his thumb and forefinger, and waited. He waited the way only a man who has waited in much worse places can wait. Still, patient, alert, his breathing slow and even, his eyes moving in the practiced pattern of a soldier, scanning a landscape for things that don't belong. He had been sitting there for almost 2 hours when his radio crackled. "Earl, you copy?" It was Brad, his voice tight with excitement. "I copy," Earl said, his voice low. "Big buck just crossed the north trail heading east toward the ravine. 10-pointer, maybe 12. Biggest deer I've ever seen in these mountains. He's moving your direction. Can you see the meadow on the far side?" Earl looked across the ravine. The meadow was there, a sloped clearing of brown grass and scattered rock, bordered by dark timber on 3 sides. The wind was hitting it from the left, gusting, unpredictable, the kind of crosswind that makes long shots a game of chance. "I see it," Earl said. "He should come out of that timber on the far side within the next 10-15 minutes if he holds his line. I'm moving to a position where I can see the clearing. Kyle, Trent, you guys want to shift east? You might get a shot from the main ridge." The radio chattered as Kyle, Trent, E and Brad all confirmed they were moving. Dale came on and said he'd hold his position in case the buck doubled back. For the next 15 minutes the ridge was alive with the quiet sound of men repositioning, boots on rock, laboured breathing through the radios, the metallic clinking of gear. They converged on the eastern edge of the ridge like a closing fist, all of them looking down at the meadow across the ravine, and then, as if the mountain itself had scripted the moment, the buck appeared. He came out of the timber on the far side of the meadow like something out of a painting, a massive white tail, 12 points at least, his rack heavy and wide and the colour of dark mahogany. He moved with the careful, deliberate gait of a mature animal who had survived enough seasons to know that open ground was dangerous, his head up, ears pivoting, nostrils working the wind. He stopped broadside at the far edge of the meadow and looked back toward the timber he had just left, as though listening for something behind him. The range was long, very long. The meadow was on the far side of the ravine, which dropped maybe 200 feet straight down before climbing back up the opposite slope. From the ridge where the hunters were positioned to the spot where the buck stood was somewhere between 600 and 700 yards, depending on who was measuring and how. The wind was gusting from the northwest at 15 to 20 miles per hour, swirling unpredictably as it hit the ravine walls, and created eddies and thermals that would push a bullet in ways no app could fully predict. Brad was the first to try. He set up his Browning on his shooting sticks, dialed his loophole turret for the estimated range, and settled in behind the scope. His crosshairs found the buck. He controlled his breathing. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the ravine, echoing off the rock walls, and the bullet kicked up dirt 15 feet in front of the deer and 8 feet to the right. The buck flinched, took 2 steps, and then froze again, looking around, trying to locate the threat. "Missed," Brad said, his voice strained on the radio. "Wind got me. I had him dead on." Kyle was next. He had set up his Bagara on a fallen log, using his backpack as a rear rest. He dialed his scope, estimated the wind hold using the swaying branches on the far ridge as a reference, and fired. The bullet hit the dirt slope behind the buck 20 yards high and to the left. The deer bolted 5 steps into the open, then stopped again, quartering away now, his head high, his body coiled. "He's going to run," Trent said urgently on the radio. "Somebody take him." Trent fired next. The Ruger precision rifle barked from its bipod, and the bullet, launched with all the authority of modern ballistic engineering, matched ammunition, and a rifle that had been zeroed on a bench rest at a temperature-controlled range, sailed cleanly over the buck's back by at least 3 feet, the crosswind lifting it like an invisible hand. The deer spun, facing uphill now, and began to move toward the timber. He was 10 yards from the tree line. In 3 seconds, he would be gone. The radios went quiet. The modern rifles, with their turrets and apps and rangefinders and custom loads, had spoken 3 times and hit nothing but dirt and air. And then there was a sound. A different sound. Not the sharp, fast crack of a modern cartridge pushed to maximum velocity, but a deeper sound. Older, like a door closing in a heavy house. The heavy, deliberate boom of a 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge fired from a rifle that had first drawn blood in a war most of these men couldn't even name. Earl had stood up from his position in the rocks. He had not used shooting sticks. He had not used a bipod. He had not dialed a turret because there was no turret to dial. He had not consulted an app. He had done something that Trent and Kyle and Brad had never seen anyone do, something so old-fashioned and so fundamental that it might as well have been magic. He had licked his right thumb and held it up in the wind. He had felt the air move across the wet skin, felt its speed, its direction, its temperature, the way the gust pulsed and paused. He had read the wind the way a man reads it when his life depends on reading it, the way he had read it 1,000 times in a frozen valley in North Korea, where the wind came down off the Manchurian plateau like the breath of something ancient and merciless. And then he had shouldered the Mosin-Nagant, settled the front sight post on a point in empty air, not on the deer, but on the space where the deer would be when the bullet arrived, and pressed the trigger with the calm, practiced squeeze of a man who had been doing this since before any of them were born. The buck dropped, not stumbled, not staggered, dropped. The way an animal drops when the shot is placed exactly where it needs to be, through the heart, instantaneous, the kind of clean kill that every hunter hopes for and so few achieve. The sound of the impact reached them a full second after the animal fell. A distant, solid thump that carried across the ravine like a period at the end of a sentence. The radios were silent. The wind blew. The echo of Earl's single shot rolled away across the mountains and faded into nothing. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Earl worked the bolt of the Mosin-Nagant, and the spent brass casing ejected and spun in the air, catching the grey morning light before it disappeared into the rocks. He did not chamber another round. He didn't need to. He stood there on the ridgeline with the rifle at his side, his canvas jacket flapping in the wind, looking across the ravine at the fallen animal, and his face held no triumph, no satisfaction, no pride. If anything, there was something almost sorrowful in his expression. The look of a man who had long ago learned that the ability to kill cleanly was not something to celebrate, but something to carry, like a weight that never gets lighter. Brad was the first one to find his voice. He was standing 30 yards to Earl's left, his Browning still resting on the shooting sticks, his mouth slightly open. How? He stopped, swallowed, tried again. How far was that? Earl didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the spot where the buck had stood, estimating the distance the way he'd been trained to estimate distance, using the terrain, the size of known objects, the angle of the slope. About 660, he said. Maybe 670, hard to say exactly with the elevation change. 660 yards, with iron sights, in a gusting crosswind, with a rifle that was manufactured sometime during World War II. Brad looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at Trent. Trent looked at his Ruger precision rifle, with its $1,800 scope and its match-grade barrel and its custom handloads, and for the first time since they had arrived at camp, he had absolutely nothing to say. Dale Sizemore, the quiet electrician from Corbin, was the only one who didn't look surprised. He walked over to Earl and nodded at him, a simple, respectful acknowledgement from one man who understood to another man who had always understood. "Hell of a shot, Earl," Dale said. Earl looked at him. "Thank you, Dale." That was all. No explanation. No boasting. No story about how he had learned to shoot or where or why. Just "thank you," spoken with the quiet dignity of a man who had been underestimated his entire life and had never once felt the need to correct anyone. The hike down into the ravine and back up to retrieve the buck took over an hour. The younger men went down while Earl stayed on the ridge. His knees wouldn't have survived the descent and climb, and when they reached the animal, they found what Earl already knew they would find. The bullet had entered just behind the left shoulder, perfectly placed, and exited through the opposite side. The heart was destroyed. The animal had been dead before it hit the ground. There was no suffering. Brad knelt beside the buck and looked at the entry wound, a clean .7.62 caliber hole, and he ran his hand over the animal's flank and shook his head slowly. When they got back to camp with the deer quartered and packed out on their backs, something had changed. The air around the fire that evening was different, quieter. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by something more uncomfortable. The dawning recognition that they had been wrong about something important, and the further recognition that being wrong about a man was not the same as being wrong about a piece of gear or a ballistic calculation. It was worse. Brad came over to where Earl was sitting and stood there for a moment, holding his beer and looking at the ground. "Earl," he said, "I owe you an apology." Earl looked up at him. "What for?" "For what I said about your rifle, about it belonging in a museum. That was ignorant, and I'm sorry." Earl studied the younger man's face for a moment, reading it the way he read wind and terrain and the movements of men and animals. Then he nodded. "Sit down, Brad." Brad sat. The other men drifted over, drawn by the gravity of the moment, the sense that something was about to happen that was worth hearing. And for the first time in 26 years, since the last time he had spoken about it to Patricia, on a night when the nightmares had been bad enough that she had held him until dawn, Earl Whitfield talked about the Chosin Reservoir. He told them about the cold, the kind of cold that Americans who have never been in a real winter cannot imagine. 40 below zero, the wind straight off the Yalu River and the Manchurian steppe beyond it. So cold that morphine froze in the surrettes, and the medics had to hold them in their mouths to thaw them before they could inject wounded men. So cold that rifle barrels became too painful to touch with bare skin and had to be operated with gloves that made everything clumsy and slow. So cold that men's boots froze to their feet and had to be cut off at the aid stations, and what was underneath the boots was black and dead and would never be the same. He told them about the night of November 27th, 1950, when the Chinese attacked in waves. Bugles and whistles in the dark, thousands of soldiers pouring over the frozen hills in white quilted uniforms, so many of them that the machine guns couldn't stop them all. His company was on the east side of the reservoir, cut off, taking fire from 3 directions. His squad leader was killed in the first hour. His M1 Garand froze after the 3rd magazine. After he picked up the Mosin-Nagant from a dead Chinese soldier who had fallen into his foxhole, just taken the rifle out of the man's stiff hands along with a bandolier of ammunition, and started shooting because stopping meant dying. He told them about the retreat. 17 days of fighting south through a gauntlet of ice and death. He told them about the night he used the Mosin-Nagant to cover the withdrawal of his squad, across a frozen bridge, lying in the snow for 4 hours, picking off soldiers on the far ridge one at a time, reading the wind by feel because there was no other way. He told them about the gouge in the stock, a rock splinter from a mortar round that landed 6 feet to his left and killed the man beside him. A private from Ohio named Donnie Marsh, who was 19 years old and had been showing Earl a picture of his girl back home just 2 hours before the round hit. He told them about coming home, about the silence, about how no one wanted to hear about Korea because it wasn't the big war, it wasn't the good war, it was the forgotten war, and the men who fought it came home to a country that had already moved on and didn't want to be reminded. About how he had put the medals in a shoebox and the rifle in the closet and gone to work at the lumber mill and tried to build a life that made sense, on top of foundations that would never quite be level. About Patricia, who was the only person in the world who knew all of it, every nightmare, every name, every frozen face, and who had loved him through it without ever asking him to be anything other than what he was. He talked for almost an hour, his voice steady and low, his eyes on the fire. The men around him were absolutely still. Trent was crying. He wasn't making a sound, but the tears were running down his face, cutting lines in the campfire soot on his cheeks. Kyle had his head down, his hands clasped between his knees, looking at nothing. Brad was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his face a mixture of shame and awe, and something that looked like it might be the beginning of genuine humility. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as though it knew this was a story that deserved to be heard in something close to silence. When Earl finished, the only sound was the wind in the pines and the hiss and pop of burning wood. He looked around at the men and saw them differently than he had the day before. They weren't bad men. They were just young. Young in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with never having been tested by anything that strips away pretense and reveals what's underneath. They had never been cold enough, scared enough, desperate enough to discover what they were made of. And Earl, who knew exactly what he was made of because a frozen valley in Korea had shown him in the most brutal way possible, did not hold it against them. He had spent his whole life not holding it against people. It was one of the things Patricia had loved most about him, his refusal to be bitter, his quiet insistence that the world could be better than it was, even when he had seen its worst. Brad reached over and put his hand on Earl's shoulder. "Thank you for telling us that," he said. His voice was thick. "Thank you for your service. And I mean that. I know people say it all the time and it doesn't always mean much, but I mean it." Earl put his hand over Brad's and squeezed it once. "You're welcome," he said, and then, because he was Earl, he smiled slightly and added, "Now help me get up. My knees are killing me." The laughter that followed was different from the laughter of the first night. It was warmer, closer, the kind of laughter that comes when walls have been taken down and something real has been built in their place. The men helped Earl to his feet. Roy, who had been sitting on the far side of the fire with tears in his own eyes, came over and clapped his friend on the back without saying a word. No words were needed. They had known each other long enough for that. The rest of that trip was different. The mockery was gone, replaced by a quiet respect that showed itself in small ways. Someone always made sure Earl's coffee was ready in the morning. Someone always offered to carry his pack. Someone always cleared the best path when they were walking through rough terrain. Trent asked Earl to teach him how to read the wind. Earl spent an afternoon with him on the ridgeline, explaining thermals and crosswinds and the way terrain channels and redirects air currents, using his thumb, a blade of grass, and decades of hard-earned knowledge. Trent listened with the focused intensity of a man who was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that there was a difference between information and that wisdom could not be downloaded. Kyle asked if he could look at the Mosin-Nagant more carefully, and Earl let him, explaining how the action worked, how the 5-round internal magazine fed, how the long barrel and heavy bullet gave the round its distinctive trajectory, not flat and fast like a modern caliber, but arcing and deliberate, requiring the shooter to understand physics in a way that a turret adjustment couldn't replace. Brad didn't ask anything. He just watched, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would glance at the old man in the canvas jacket and the worn Red Wing boots, and his expression would shift into something that looked a lot like the face of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of what it means to be strong. On the last morning, as they were breaking camp and loading gear into trucks, Brad walked over to Earl with something in his hands. It was a small wooden box, the kind that expensive knives come in, and inside it was a brass cartridge, a 7.62 by 54 rimmed round, polished to a mirror finish, mounted on a small walnut base. "I drove into town last night and had this made at the hardware store," Brad said, holding it out. "The round's the same caliber as your rifle. I figured you should have something to mark the shot." Earl took the box and looked at the polished round, gleaming on its walnut stand, and something moved across his face that was difficult to name. It wasn't quite sadness and it wasn't quite happiness. It was the expression of a man who has carried something alone for a very long time and has suddenly, unexpectedly been seen. "I appreciate this, Brad," Earl said. His voice was quiet but steady. "More than you know." "Can I ask you something?" Brad said. Earl nodded. "That shot yesterday, 660 yards, iron sights, crosswind. How did you know you could make it?" Earl looked out at the mountains, the ridges layered in morning mist, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know I could make it," he said finally. "I just knew I wasn't going to miss." Brad stared at him for a moment, and then he laughed. A genuine laugh, full of respect and something that sounded almost like wonder. "That's the most badass thing anyone has ever said to me." Earl shook his head. "It's not about being badass, son. It's about knowing your rifle, knowing the wind, knowing yourself. That's all it's ever been." He paused. "And not being afraid to trust what you know, even when everyone around you is telling you that what you know doesn't matter anymore." He turned the polished brass cartridge in the light, and for a moment the morning sun caught it and threw a tiny spark of gold across his weathered hands. "Everything gets old," he said. "That doesn't mean it stops working." They left the mountain that morning in a line of trucks, winding down the gravel forest road through tunnels of red and gold leaves. Earl sat in the passenger seat of Roy's Ford with the Mosin-Nagant in its canvas case between his knees and the brass cartridge box in his jacket pocket. Roy drove without talking, the way old friends can, comfortable in a silence that says more than conversation. When they got to the paved road at the bottom of the mountain, Roy finally spoke. "You did good up there, Earl." Earl looked at him. "I shot a deer, Roy, that's all." "That's not all, and you know it." Earl smiled. A real smile this time, not the careful half-smile he used as a shield, but the full thing, the one that Patricia used to say could light up a room if he ever bothered to use it. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but the deer was the easy part." They drove home through the Kentucky hills, the old Ford humming on the two-lane blacktop, the mountains all around them blazing with colour. In the bed of the truck next to the coolers of venison, the battered Mosin-Nagant rode in its canvas case, quiet and patient and ready, the way it had been for over 70 years, the way Earl had been for over 70 years. Quiet, patient, ready, not obsolete, not a relic, not a museum piece, just waiting for someone to ask the right question, and then answering it with a single, perfect, undeniable shot. 2 weeks after the hunting trip, Earl was sitting on his front porch in the late afternoon light when a truck pulled into his driveway that he didn't recognize. It was new, dark blue with out-of-county plates. The door opened and Brad Danvers stepped out, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his usual head-to-toe camo, and he was carrying a large flat package wrapped in brown paper. "Hope I'm not intruding," Brad said, walking up the porch steps. Earl gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Have a seat. Coffee?" "That'd be great." Earl went inside and came back with 2 mugs, and they sat for a moment in the kind of easy quiet that hadn't existed between them 10 days ago. Then Brad handed him the package. "I had this made," he said. "Open it." Earl unwrapped the brown paper carefully, the way men of his generation unwrap things, saving the paper, not tearing it. Inside was a framed photograph, not a print, but a real photograph, taken by Brad that last morning at camp when Earl wasn't paying attention. It showed Earl standing on the ridgeline in his canvas jacket, the Mosin-Nagant at his side, looking out over the ravine toward the far meadow. The morning light was hitting him from the left, and the wind had caught his jacket, and the mountains behind him were layered in mist and autumn colour. It was a stunning image, but it was what was written on the matting beneath the photograph that made Earl's throat tighten and his eyes grow bright. In simple black text it read, "Corporal Earl Whitfield, U.S. Army, 7th Infantry Division, Chosin Reservoir, Korea, 1950. A man is not measured by the age of his rifle, but by the steadiness of his aim and the weight of what he carries." Earl looked at the photograph for a long time, a very long time. The afternoon light moved across the porch, and the shadows of the trees lengthened across the yard, and he just sat there looking at it, his weathered hands holding the frame carefully, the way you hold something that is both heavy and fragile at the same time. "Brad," he said finally, and his voice was not quite steady, "this is—" He stopped, tried again. "This is very fine. You deserve it, Earl. You deserve a lot more than it." Earl shook his head slowly. "I don't need more than this." He set the frame carefully on the small table between their chairs and picked up his coffee. "Patricia would have liked you," he said quietly. It was, Roy would later tell Brad, the highest compliment Earl Whitfield had ever given anyone. They sat on the porch together as the sun went down, 2 men from different worlds who had found something worth respecting in each other, and the light faded over the Kentucky hills the way it always does, slowly, beautifully, without asking anyone's permission. The framed photograph would hang on the wall of Earl's living room for the rest of his life, right next to the wedding portrait of him and Patricia, right above the closet where the Mosin-Nagant stood in its canvas case. And on the mantel below both photographs, on its small walnut stand, the polished brass cartridge caught the light every morning when the sun came through the east window, a small bright point of gold in a quiet house, proof that some things do not have to be new to be powerful. And some men do not have to be young to be strong, and some shots, the ones that matter most, are not about hitting a target at all. They're about proving that the thing everyone counted out still has the power to silence every doubt in the room. 3 months later, Brad sent an email to the regional chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. In it, he described what had happened at the hunting camp, not the shot itself, but the story that followed it. The story of a man who had fought at the chosen reservoir and come home to a country that forgot about him, who had carried his service in silence for over 70 years, who had never asked for recognition and never received it, and who deserved both. The chapter commander, a Gulf War veteran named Hank Morland, read the email and picked up the phone. 2 months after that, on a cold February morning, a small ceremony was held at the VFW Hall in Harlan. Earl stood at the front of the room in a suit he hadn't worn since Patricia's funeral, looking uncomfortable and slightly bewildered, while Commander Morland read a citation that summarized his service record, the engagements, the medals, the acts of valor that Earl had never once mentioned to anyone outside of his wife. There were about 40 people in the room. Roy was there, sitting in the front row with his wife. Brad was there, with Kyle and Trent and Dale. The county judge was there. The high school's JROTC color guard presented the flag. And when Commander Morland finished reading the citation, and the room stood and applauded, Earl did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He cried, not much, not loudly. Just a few tears that he wiped away quickly with the back of his hand, the way a man does when he has spent a lifetime being strong and suddenly finds himself in the presence of something that is stronger. Afterward, Roy found him standing by the back door, looking out at the parking lot and the grey February sky. "You okay?" Roy asked. Earl nodded. He was holding the folded citation in his hands, and his eyes were still bright. "Patricia should have been here," he said. Roy put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "She was, Earl. She was?" Earl looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded again, slowly, and the smallest trace of that real smile, the one Patricia had loved, crossed his face. He turned back toward the room where the people who had come to honor him were waiting. And he walked back in with his shoulders straight and his head up, the way he had walked out of the Chosin Reservoir 75 years ago, carrying everything he had and leaving nothing behind. If you believe that the people who served this country deserve to be remembered, not for the weapons they carried or the wars they fought, but for the quiet strength they brought home and carried with them every single day, then subscribe to this channel. Because that's what we do here. We tell the stories of people like Earl Whitfield, the ones the world overlooked, the ones who never asked for anything, the ones who silenced every room they walked into, not with their voices, but with a single, steady, undeniable shot. Subscribe and make sure these stories never go unheard.